Imagine having everything: a beautiful wife, a life of luxury, and the perfect marriage, only to discover it's all built on lies. He gave her everything she ever wanted, but it was never enough. When his mother fell ill and the bills piled up, she revealed her true colors. Luxury became more important than love, and her secret lover, a wealthy lawyer, promised her the world. Until the truth came crashing down. Betrayal, scandal, and revenge. This isn't just the end of a marriage, it's the beginning of a storm. And when it hits, no one escapes. Are you ready to watch it unfold?
From the moment I started working for my father's company, life seemed perfect. I had it all: stability, security, and more than enough money to give my wife everything she could ever want. And I did. Oh, how I spoiled her. I wanted to see her draped in luxury, living a life of ease. She deserved the best, I thought, and I loved watching her light up with every gift. Her hair perfectly styled, her nails always polished to a shine, and that car I bought just for her. Every time she slid behind the wheel, I could see the satisfaction in her eyes, the way she looked at herself in the rearview mirror. It made me feel like a king, like I was doing my job as a husband and provider. But beneath all of that, I started to wonder, was it enough? I'd watch her as she enjoyed those little indulgences. The way she smiled, that flicker of joy when she returned from the salon, her nails tracing her lips as she admired herself in the mirror. There was a time when her happiness fueled me, made me feel proud of all I could give her. I'd worked hard to make sure she never had to worry about anything, and I believed that keeping her wrapped in comfort was the key to our happiness. But slowly, something began to shift. It was small at first, subtle, just a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. Maybe it was the way her laughter didn't reach her eyes like it used to, or the way she'd spend hours distracted, more invested in her luxuries than in me. Was I imagining it? I brushed it off, telling myself that we were fine. We were happy, weren't we? Yet, those fleeting thoughts kept creeping in. I couldn't shake them. I started noticing little things. How she seemed more consumed by her appearance, the way her phone would light up late at night with messages I wasn't meant to see. I wanted to believe that I had everything under control, that providing for her would keep everything steady. But the more I gave, the more she seemed to slip through my fingers, like I was holding on to water, trying to keep it from evaporating. Her smile still lingered, but now it felt like a mask. Something was changing, and I couldn't quite place it yet. All I knew was that the storm was brewing. I just didn't know how close it was. Everything began to unravel when my mother got sick. What had once been a life of luxury, a dream I'd built for us, started to crack under the weight of her mounting medical bills. My father, the rock of our family, couldn't handle it alone, and I knew I had to step up. There was no question in my mind. I had to protect my mother, but that meant something had to give. The money that once flowed so easily toward my wife's every whim had to be redirected. I needed her to understand that. I approached her one evening, expecting support. After all, we were in this together, weren't we? I gently explained that we'd need to cut back. Just a little. Nothing drastic. Just enough to ease the pressure. I was prepared for a conversation, maybe a little resistance, but nothing could have prepared me for her reaction. Her eyes blazed with fury, like I had just ripped away her very essence. "How am I supposed to survive on less than $200 a month?" she spat, as if I'd asked her to live on crumbs. I could hardly believe the words coming out of her mouth. She started listing off things I didn't even care to think about: hair appointments, new dresses, perfumes I could never even pronounce. Each demand from her felt like a slap, a cold reminder that none of this was about us anymore. It was all about her. It was then that I realized. My wife was no longer satisfied with what I could give her. No matter how much I sacrificed, it wasn't enough. Her happiness was no longer rooted in the life we shared, but in the luxuries she clung to, like an addict desperate for a fix. The woman I loved, the one who used to find joy in our moments together, was slipping away. And in her place was someone I'd barely recognized. I convinced myself that this was just a phase, that she'd come around. I had to believe it, because the alternative was too painful. But every day that passed, she grew colder, more distant. The luxury, the indulgence, those were the only things that seemed to matter to her, and it was tearing us apart. The more I asked her to understand, the more she pulled away, her detachment suffocating me. I thought I had control over our life, our future. But the storm wasn't just brewing anymore. It was here, and I could feel it pressing in on me from every side. And yet, I still didn't know the worst of it. I knew asking her to cut back on expenses would be hard for her, but I never expected the complete meltdown that followed. When I sat her down and explained that we needed to reduce the spending, I thought she'd understand. After all, this was about helping my mother, about keeping our family together. But her reaction, it was like I had stripped her of something vital, something she couldn't live without. "How am I supposed to survive with less than $200 a month?" she screamed, her voice shaking with anger. It wasn't just frustration in her tone. It was entitlement pure and raw. I could hardly believe it. The woman I thought I knew, the one I had spent years building a life with, was standing there in front of me. But she might as well have been a stranger. The way she rattled off her necessities, new clothes, salon appointments, expensive perfumes, as if she couldn't exist without them. It felt like a knife twisting in my gut. And there it was, material things, her satisfaction, her happiness, her entire sense of self-worth had been wrapped up in luxury and indulgence. All those little things I had given her, all the ways I thought I was showing my love, they had turned into chains, binding her to something I couldn't compete with anymore. I watched her, standing there, arms crossed, her face set in an icy glare, and all I could feel was this overwhelming sense of loss. The woman I loved was gone. In her place was someone I didn't recognize, someone who didn't seem to care about anything but keeping up her glamorous lifestyle. I tried to talk sense into her, tried to explain that this was just temporary, that we'd be back on track soon enough. But no matter how much I pleaded, no matter how reasonable I tried to be, she wasn't hearing it. She was stuck in her own world, one that revolved around indulgence and pleasure, and there was no room for me in it anymore. The more I tried to reach her, the more she pulled away. She became distant, her once warm touches now cold and absent. There were moments, though, when I'd catch her eye, and for a second, I thought I could see a flicker of the woman I used to know. But then it was gone, replaced by that cold, calculating stare, like she was already planning her next move. And that's when it hit me. There was more going on here than just her anger over the money. Something deeper, something darker. As I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling while she slept beside me, I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me. What had I missed? What was she hiding? The doubts gnawed at me, slowly eating away at any trust one still had left. I needed to know what was going on, but I wasn't prepared for what I would find. Her behavior was becoming impossible to ignore. The woman who once found joy in the simple pleasures of life was now distant, her warmth replaced by something cold and calculating. And those little day trips she had started taking, they didn't make sense. She'd be gone for hours, returning with excuses that didn't quite add up. "Oh, I just went to pick up something special," she'd say. Or, "I met up with an old friend," but something in her voice, in the way she avoided my eyes, made my stomach twist with unease. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. I wanted to believe her, to trust that these small lies weren't anything more than misunderstandings. But that doubt, it started to grow. Every time she left the house, I felt the tension build inside me. Where was she really going? What was she doing for all those hours she spent away? I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on other things, but the nagging suspicion was like a dark cloud hanging over me, blocking out any sense of peace. I had to know. I needed answers. So, I did something I never thought I'd have to do. I installed a tracker on her car. It wasn't something I did lightly. It felt wrong, like I was invading her privacy. But I justified it by telling myself I just wanted the truth. If she had nothing to hide, then I had nothing to worry about, right? But deep down, I knew better. The storm had been building for too long. The first few days after the tracker was installed, I watched her routine. Nothing out of the ordinary, at least at first. She would go to the salon, meet friends for lunch, just as she'd always said. But then one day, she drove somewhere different. A small town about 2 hours away. A place where we had no friends, no family, no reason to be. My heart raced as I watched her drive further and further from home. What was she doing there? I spent the rest of that day on edge, waiting for her to come home. When she did, I played it cool, acting like nothing had changed. But inside, my mind was racing. Why was she spending time in that town? Was there someone else? Each time she left the house after that, I was glued to the tracker, following her movements. The more I watched, the more my suspicions grew. She wasn't just visiting a friend. She was lying to me. And the worst part, I could feel it deep in my gut. There was someone else. I didn't have proof yet, but every piece of the puzzle was falling into place. The late-night texts, the distant glances, the way she brushed me off when I tried to be close to her. It all pointed to something I didn't want to believe. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, and I was willing to do whatever it took to get them. So I waited for the next time she slipped out the door, and I followed her. I'd known something was wrong for weeks, maybe even months, but nothing could have prepared me for the truth I uncovered. The day I decided to follow her, I felt like my entire world was about to shatter, and I wasn't wrong. I trailed her car from a distance, my heart pounding in my chest. She drove straight to that small town again, the one a few hours away. I could feel the anxiety tightening like a vice around my throat as we got closer. Who was there? What was she hiding? The question spun in my mind, and as much as I wanted to turn the car around, I couldn't stop. I needed to know. She parked in front of a sleek, modern building, a law office. From what I could tell, I stayed in the car, watching from a safe distance, and then I saw him. A man older, sharply dressed, with that kind of confidence that comes from years of money and power. He stepped out of the office, and she practically melted into him. The way she smiled at him, the way her body pressed against his. There was no mistaking it. My worst fears were true. I wanted to scream, to storm out of the car and rip them apart, but I didn't. Instead, I just sat there, numb, watching as the two of them laughed, touched, like they didn't have a care in the world, like I didn't exist. Later that night, I waited until she fell asleep, my mind still racing, my stomach churning with the weight of what I'd seen. I needed proof. I needed to see it with my own eyes. So I picked up her phone, my hands shaking as I scrolled through her messages. And there it was, a hidden messaging app, one I had never noticed before. I opened it and my blood ran cold. The messages between them were explicit, words filled with passion, promises, and plans. My wife, was telling him how much she missed him, how she felt suffocated by me, by our life. She spoke of feeling trapped by the lack of luxury I could no longer provide, and how this man, this older lawyer, was giving her everything I couldn't. It wasn't just emotional, it was physical, too. She described their encounters, their secret meetings. I read every filthy word, each one slicing through me like a blade. She was using him, using me, for money, for pleasure, for her own selfish desires. Every message was proof that the woman I thought I loved had been living a lie. My chest felt tight, my breath ragged. I had suspected, but reading those words, seeing how easily she betrayed me, it broke something inside me. This wasn't just some fling. She had been seeing him for months, ever since I'd asked her to cut back on spending. She had turned to him to maintain the life of indulgence I could no longer offer her. And every time she touched me, every time she kissed me, it had been a lie. I put the phone down, my hands trembling, my mind racing. There was no going back now. I had all the proof I needed, but the truth didn't feel like a relief. It felt like the end of everything, and I knew that once I confronted her, There would be no more pretending, no more illusions. The storm that had been brewing was about to hit, and I wasn't sure if either of us would survive it. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy knot of anger and betrayal twisting inside me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't pretend that everything was okay, that the life we had was real. I had seen the truth. I had read her words. There was no turning back. She came down for breakfast, looking flawless as ever, her hair perfectly styled, makeup flawless, an image of perfection. It made me sick. She sat across from me, her eyes barely meeting mine, scrolling through her phone like it was just another normal day. But today was different. Today, she would face the truth. I waited, the silence between us stretching, thick with unspoken words. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I tossed her phone on the table, the hidden messaging app open for her to see. Her eyes widened for a split second before she quickly masked it with a calm that only infuriated me more. "What the hell is this?" I asked, my voice low but vibrating with the anger I was barely holding back. She stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the phone like she was searching for an excuse. But there were no excuses left. I had caught her, red-handed. Finally, she looked up at me, her lips parting as if to say something, but I didn't let her. "Don't you dare try to lie to me again," I spat, my control slipping. "I know everything. The messages, the trips to see him, all of it." Her face paled, and for the first time in a long time, I saw real fear in her eyes. She knew there was no escaping this. Still, she tried to spin it. "It's not what you think," she stammered, reaching across the table toward me, but I pulled back, disgusted by her touch. I was just confused. Things have been hard lately, and... Confused? I cut her off, my voice rising as the rage inside me boiled over. "You've been sleeping with another man for months, using him for money for everything, and you have the nerve to say you were confused." She flinched, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The betrayal, the humiliation, it was all too much. "I gave you everything," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I sacrificed for you, and this is how you repay me." She looked down at her hands, her perfectly manicured nails that I had paid for, and for a moment, I thought I saw regret in her eyes. But then, she straightened her shoulders, her expression hardening. "You weren't giving me what I needed," she said, her voice cold. "You couldn't..." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. There it was, the ugly truth. She didn't even try to hide it anymore. She didn't care. She had chosen her luxuries, her selfish desires, over us, over everything we had built. I stood up, my chest heaving as I fought to control the flood of emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. "Get out," I said, my voice deadly calm. "Take your things and leave." Her eyes widened in shock, like she couldn't believe I was serious. "What? You can't just..." I said, "Get out." I roared, my voice echoing through the house. I grabbed her phone and her keys, throwing them out the front door. "You think you can lie to me, betray me, and just stay here like nothing happened? You're done." She stood up, shaking, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Please, let me explain." But I was done listening, done with her lies. I watched her scramble outside, tears streaming down her face as she picked up her phone and keys from the driveway. She looked back at me pleading, but I didn't budge. I slammed the door shut, locking her out of my life for good. The silence that followed was deafening. I leaned against the door, my body trembling with the aftermath of it all. It was over. The life I thought I had, the woman I thought I loved, it was all gone. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. After I kicked her out, I thought the worst was over. I imagined she'd run straight into his arms, into that safe little bubble she had built for herself with him. But what I didn't expect was the call I got a few days later. It was her. She was crying, her voice shaking as she tried to explain what had happened after she left. "He didn't want me," she sobbed, her words barely coherent through the tears. He said it wasn't serious, that he didn't want anything more. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then, I remembered everything she had done, everything she had lied about, everything she had betrayed, and that small flicker of pity was smothered by something much colder. She had chosen him. She had left me behind for her lover, thinking he'd save her, thinking he'd give her what I couldn't. And now, he was throwing her away. She had walked into his office that morning, expecting to be welcomed with open arms. She had planned to stay with him, maybe even continue the life of luxury she had gotten used to. But the moment she tried to make their relationship something real, something serious, he had shut her down. Hard. He said he was just having fun, she choked out, her voice filled with disbelief. That it was never about anything more than sex. The irony of it all hit me like a wave. She had built her life around this man, around his promises and his money, only to find out that he never saw her as anything more than a distraction, a plaything. The man she had betrayed me for was no savior. He was just another user like her. She kept talking, trying to explain how it all fell apart, but I didn't need to hear any more. I could already see it, her face, full of shock and hurt, as he told her it was over. She must have looked at him the way she used to look at me. Desperate, needy, willing to do anything to keep her luxurious life intact. But he wasn't me. He didn't care. In his eyes, she was just another woman he had used, another body in his bed, another toy to be discarded when he got bored. And now, she was left with nothing. He won't answer my calls anymore, she whispered, the shame and defeat in her voice almost palpable. I thought he loved me. I laughed, a bitter sound escaping my throat. You really thought he was going to save you? After everything you did? She sniffled, her breath catching as she tried to regain some composure. I didn't know what else to do. I didn't think. I thought. You thought wrong. I cut her off, my voice cold, emotionless. Now you're just as alone as you left me. The line went silent for a moment, and I could feel her trying to process it all. The rejection, the loss, the fact that the man she threw everything away for didn't care about her in the end. But I wasn't going to let her pull me back into her web of lies and excuses. This was her mess to clean up. She had made her choice. I have nothing, she whispered, her voice breaking. No one, not even him. And with that, I hung up the phone, leaving her to face the truth of her own destruction. After being tossed aside by her lover, she was left with nothing. And in her desperation, she turned to the last place I ever expected, the church. I heard about it through whispers, a rumor that spread quickly through our small community. The woman who had once lived a life of indulgence and luxury was now standing before the pastor, her eyes swollen with tears, asking for help. For a moment, I could hardly believe it. This was the same woman who had scoffed at the idea of simplicity, who had surrounded herself with material pleasures as if they were the only things that mattered. Now, she was begging at the feet of the church for a way out of the mess she had created. It was hard to imagine her walking into that place, her designer clothes a sharp contrast to the modest surroundings, the humble faces of the congregation looking at her, probably confused as to why she was there. She'd always been good at keeping up appearances. Even in her downfall, she would have tried to maintain that illusion. But this time, it wasn't working. She went to the pastor, pleading not just for spiritual guidance, but for money. She was lost, homeless, and with no one else to turn to. The man who had promised her the world had left her with nothing but broken dreams. And now, she was hoping that the church, with all its compassion and mercy, could give her what I no longer would. The pastor listened, of course. He's a good man. But I heard from someone in the congregation that he was confused. I thought she was still married, he had said, genuinely puzzled as she tried to spin her story in a way that made her look like the victim. She told him how hard things had been, how I had thrown her out, how her life had fallen apart. But she left out the part about the affair, the betrayal, the lies. She wasn't there for redemption. She was there for survival. But the community wasn't blind. People talk, and it didn't take long for the truth to come out. Slowly, word spread about her affair with the rich lawyer, about how she had used him for money and pleasure, how she had betrayed her marriage, her home. The very people she was trying to deceive began to turn away from her, the whispers following her every step. At first, she had tried to put on a brave face. She asked the pastor to pray for her, to help her find a way to rebuild her life. But even he, with his patience and kindness, could see that she wasn't looking for redemption. She was looking for a handout. And once the truth of her betrayal started to circulate, there wasn't much sympathy left. The woman who had once been the envy of the town, who had flaunted her wealth and status, was now standing in front of a community that had no pity left for her. The image she had worked so hard to create was crumbling, just like everything else in her life. It was poetic, really. She had always thought she was above everyone else, that her beauty, her charms, her luxury would keep her safe. But now, she was standing in the very place she had never wanted to be, asking for mercy from people who had none left to give. I heard from a friend later that she left the church that day with nothing, no money, no sympathy, just a heavy weight of shame that she would carry with her for a long time. The day I filed for divorce, it felt like a weight had finally lifted off my shoulders. After everything that had happened, after all the lies and betrayal, there was no question in my mind that this was the only way forward. There was no saving what we had, no mending the broken pieces of our life together. I was done. I went into that courtroom with everything on my side. I had the evidence, the proof of her infidelity, the text messages, the hidden affair with the lawyer who had used her and tossed her aside like she was nothing. The judge saw it all, and it was clear who was in the wrong. She showed up, of course, looking as composed as ever, like she hadn't just destroyed everything we had built. But beneath that polished exterior, I could see the cracks. She was scared. For the first time in a long time, she didn't have control of the situation, and it showed. I watched her sit there, her perfectly manicured hands folded neatly in her lap, as the evidence of her betrayal was laid out before the court. Her lawyer tried to argue for a fair settlement, claiming she was entitled to half of everything, half of the life we had built together, half of the money, the assets, the house I had worked so hard to provide. But with the proof of her affair, with the cold, hard facts staring the court in the face, it wasn't hard to see through the lies. In the end, she got next to nothing. The judge granted me the house, the majority of our assets, everything that mattered. All she walked away with was the car I had bought her. The irony of it wasn't lost on me. The same car she had used to sneak away to her lover's arms was now the only thing she had left. It was fitting, in a way, a final, twisted reminder of everything she had thrown away. She didn't look at me as the judge gave the final ruling. She didn't cry, didn't make a scene, but I could see the bitterness in her eyes, the quiet disbelief that she had lost it all. She had gambled everything on her affair, thinking she could have it all, and in the end, she was left with nothing but a luxury car and a trail of shattered illusions. After the divorce was finalized, I walked out of that courtroom with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. The storm was over, and I had survived it. I had kept my home, my dignity, and most of all, my freedom. She, on the other hand, was left to pick up the pieces of the life she had destroyed. From what I heard later, she tried to fight the ruling, tried to find some way to claw back what she had lost. But it was too late. The law was on my side, and no amount of manipulation or pleading was going to change that. It was over. She was out of my life for good, and I was free to start again. The divorce wasn't just a legal separation. It was a clean break, a severing of the ties that had bound me to her deceit and betrayal. And as I drove away from the courthouse, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The divorce had been a long time coming, and once it was finalized, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The chaos, the betrayal, the lies, it was all behind me now. With her out of my life, I could focus on the things that really mattered, the things that had always mattered. My mother, the reason this entire storm had started in the first place, had finally recovered. After months of worry and medical bills piling up, seeing her smile again brought a peace I hadn't known in what felt like forever. It was a reminder that there was still good in the world, still things worth fighting for, even after everything that had happened. She had been my rock through it all, even when she didn't know what I was going through. And now, seeing her healthy again, I knew that all the sacrifices had been worth it. With the divorce behind me and my family healing, I started to rebuild. Slowly at first. It wasn't easy to shake off the damage she had done, the trust she had shattered. But day by day, I felt myself growing stronger, moving further away from the man who had been so deeply hurt by her betrayal. The house was mine again, not just legally, but emotionally. It no longer felt haunted by the memories of our failed marriage. Instead, it became a place of warmth and comfort, a place where I could start over. The emptiness she had left behind was slowly being filled with new possibilities, with hope for the future. I kept hearing things about her now and then, how she was struggling to rebuild her life after losing everything, how the community had turned its back on her after finding out the truth. But that wasn't my problem anymore. She had made her choices, and she was living with the consequences. I didn't need to carry that weight anymore. I had my own life to live, my own future to build. As for me, I took things slow. There was no rush. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the pressure to be anything other than myself. The chaos of the past was gone, and with it, the need to constantly prove my worth to someone who had never truly valued it. I spent more time with my family, with friends who had stuck by me through the worst of it. I found peace in the simple things again. It wasn't about the luxuries, the material things anymore. Those things had only brought me pain, had only attracted someone who was more interested in status than love. Now, I was focused on building a life that was real, grounded in things that couldn't be taken away by betrayal or greed. Looking back, I realized how much I had grown. The man I was when this all began was gone. I had been hurt, yes, broken even, but I had come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to never lose myself again. The recovery wasn't just about me. It was about my family, too. The people who had always been there, even when I hadn't seen it. My mother, my father, they had been my real foundation all along. And now, with my life back on track and my heart starting to heal, I knew I could move forward without the shadows of the past holding me down. The storm had passed, and as I stood in the calm that followed, I realized that the future was mine to create. A new chapter, one filled with possibilities I hadn't even imagined before. And this time, I wasn't building it for someone else. I was building it for me.
Keep watching our stories by clicking on one of the videos that appear on the screen, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to be alerted about new videos. See you next time.